Hypotheses put forward to explain this, some of which involve plate tectonics, like episodic plate tectonics or cessation of plate tectonics. But you can also perhaps explain it just through volcanism. Then also some features, this is sort of topographic map of of a region of the surface of Venus, and there are features on the surface that topographically are very similar to subduction-related features on Earth. And so there have been several papers published that sort of propose that these are subduction zones. But again, that's somewhat controversial. But it's one sort of well-established concept is that early Earth was probably different from present-day Earth. There are several reasons for thinking that the early Earth would not have had subduction as Earth does today. And one of the main reasons is that if you wind the planet back, you'd expect the mantle to be hotter and produce thicker oceanic crust. And the oceanic crust is buoyant until you take it down far enough to convert to eclogite. So that would make the overall slab buoyant and unable to subduct. And there are some inherent scaling reasons that I might go into shortly. So there have been possibilities proposed for the tectonics of early Earth, such as subduction below the crust, or more distributed plate boundaries, or even no plate tectonics, just a stagnant or rigid lid. So how about subduction? Why does it occur? Well, if we just think of the first order aspect of the rheology of rocks, it is that it's very temperature dependent. So if we write down a typical viscosity law, like exponential E over kT, and then put in a sort of laboratory activation energy, and then over the lithosphere, we say the temperature goes from about 300 K at the surface to 1600 K in the asthenosphere. Then we predict a variation of about 48 orders of magnitude of viscosity. So, according to this, the upper part of the plate should be completely rigid. And so it's not surprising that it is on other planets. What's surprising is that we get plate tectonics on Earth. And so, why do we get plate tectonics? It's not really understood at a fundamental level, which means you can't write down a set of equations that would explain why plate tectonics works, and is also derived from sort of laboratory or theoretical data on rocks. And the reason is that rock deformation is complex and it's also multi-scale. So we've had several mechanisms: viscous, brittle, plastic, elastic, and deformation is also non-linear. It's dependent on various things like grain size, composition. Obviously, there's a range of length scales from faults to thousands of kilometers, and time scales from seconds, earthquakes to billions of years. But in global models, I mean, we can't model everything, the full rheology and the full range of time scales and length scales. So you have to try and find an approximation that's as simple as possible, while still capturing, we hope, the basic physics. And so the one basic observation is that rocks have a finite strength. Based on laboratory experiments. When a rock is squeezed in the laboratory, the differential stress, which is plotted on this axis, this is the maximum differential stress before the rock deforms substantially, and this is the confining pressure. So a rock does have a finite strength, and this increases with confining pressure and then appears to saturate. So this has led to, I'm sure everyone's familiar with this, profiles of the strength of the lithosphere, where the strength increases at shallow depth, and then saturates at some value. This is for the continent, this is for the oceans. And then decreases again once you get to the viscous creep regime. And so if you just insert that, together with temperature-dependent viscosity, into a numerical model, then you can get something that resembles plate tectonics. So a very high, so the thing that's put in here is the a yield stress, some maximum stress that can be experienced. So at high yield stress, you do get stagnant lid convection, so a single sort of stagnant lithosphere. But at lower yield stress, you do get something that resembles plate tectonics, where this is viscosity plotted here, so this is a high viscosity plate, this is like a spreading center, the plate thickens as it moves along and goes down at the subduction zone. These basic ingredients, just temperature-dependent viscosity plus plastic yielding, seem to give you something like plate tectonics. And a few years ago, we did the same type of models in spherical geometry and got the same type of thing. So stagnant lid, plate tectonics. And I can show some movers of this just to clarify what these modes are like. This is stagnant lid convection, so the lithosphere is very strong and it's deforming only extremely slowly. This is convection taking place below the lithosphere. The red things are hot upwellings and the blue things are downwellings. But then if you lower the yield stress, you get mobile lid mode, where now these purple areas are weak zones, so they're either spreading centers or subduction zones. And on the right we can see subduction zones in blue and spreading centers in red. And this is another case with a slower evolution. So blue, this is subduction, so this is your slabs occurring here. This is, by the red color, you can tell that this is a spreading center. And all this is evolving sort of self-consistently from the governing equations. We're not imposing any plate-like behavior here. And so by running a number of calculations like this, you can derive some scalings. And this shows, for example, the convective regime as a function of yield stress and Rayleigh number, where Rayleigh number is, the higher the Rayleigh number is, the more vigorous the convection. And what we see is that at high Rayleigh number, or high yield stress, you tend to get the rigid lid mode, and then at lower Rayleigh number, or lower yield stress, you get mobile lid, plate tectonics type convection. And just thinking about the evolution of the Earth, early on the mantle was hot, the viscosity was lower. You would expect it to start at high Rayleigh number, and with time the Rayleigh number would decrease. And so just from this simple scaling, you might expect that early Earth would be more likely to be in a stagnant lid mode, and with time, as it cools, convection becomes less vigorous, it might transition to mobile lid mode. Now, another thing that affects this is internal heating. So this is another plot that shows the convective regime, as in mobile being black and stagnant being red, as a function of the yield stress and the internal heating rate. So at high internal heating rates, you tend to get stagnant lid. Low internal heating rates, you get mobile lid. So again, thinking about a cooling planet, just early on that the concentration of heat-producing elements was higher, and with time they decrease because of radioactive decay. And so you might expect it to start off, say, up here, and then with time the internal heating rate decreases. So again, this would predict a transition from rigid lid to mobile lid, subduction and plate tectonics. So just based on simple scalings derived from numerical experiments, plate tectonics is favoured at higher mantle viscosity, which lower Rayleigh number, and lower internal heating, both of which predict a transition from stagnant to plate tectonics as the Earth cools. So, okay. But a problem in these types of models is that when you look in detail at the type of subduction you get, it's not very realistic. It's two-sided, which means that both this plate and this plate are converging, and they're joined together to make a single subducting slab, which is not what happens on Earth. So we've been examining what are the limiting factors, and one of the features of almost all global mantle convection models is that the upper boundary is assumed to be flat. It's a so-called free slip boundary condition. And of course the surface of the Earth is not flat, particularly at subduction zones, because you get trenches, and which occur here. And already some models in which a plate is inserted and then allowed to drop show that there's a difference between models where you get a completely flat surface and models where the surface is allowed to deflect vertically. In other words, a free surface as opposed to a free slip surface. So we ran these convection models with these two different types of boundary condition, a free surface or a free slip surface, and found a first order difference in the results. So at the top is the free slip case with symmetric, double-sided subduction as usual. But then simply changing the upper boundary condition to a free surface changes the subduction to single-sided. And here's a zoom in of the subduction zone. Here's another. This is the viscosity field. So the first order difference to the type of subduction. And another thing that helps actually is to have a layer of weak sediments between the subducting slab and the overriding plate, which helps to decouple them and stop the subducting plate from dragging down the overriding plate. Here are some movies of this. So the main variable here is the friction coefficient, and you see that this is actually a pretty low value required to get subduction. But there we saw some single-sided subduction taking place. Unfortunately, it eventually shuts off, and you get stagnant behavior. And now with a higher friction coefficient, stronger plate, subduction actually continues in a more coherent manner here. So at the top it was more patchy, but here having the plate being stronger allows the subduction to continue for a longer period of time before shutting off. And then, if the friction coefficient is too high, then it just immediately shuts off. And so there are two main controlling parameters here. One is this friction coefficient, and the other turns out to be an increase of viscosity with depth. So it turns out to be helpful if the viscosity increases with depth, because this helps to prevent slab detachment. If the viscosity does not increase with depth, then the slab tends to rapidly break off, and then subduction stops. But having some increasing resistance with depth slows it down and prevents this. So again, we can map out different parameter ranges or different behaviors as a function of the controlling parameters. And now I show a 3D spherical version of this. And what you can see is nice single-sided subduction occurring in several places at once, or actually they're connected. With time, some upwelling plumes develop over here. Okay. And then it's interesting to zoom in on the single subduction zone. Don't know why the mover's not playing. Oops, anyway, okay. But one thing these models lack is continents. They have only oceanic plates, and so Student Tobias Rolf has been studying the influence of continents on plate tectonics with self-consistently generated. And this shows a typical case. So this is with 6 initial continents that are, and on the right we see the viscosity field, so you can see the plate boundaries here. So they move around, sometimes they join together in a sort of chain-like arrangement, sometimes they join together, let's see here's a chain, into more of a supercontinent arrangement, sometimes they split up. So there's a lot of time dependence. This is the case with a single large continent, supercontinent, and here it seems to revolve somewhat more slowly and display less variation. So we can look at movers, but again, what we want to do is understand, quantitatively how continents influence things. And the first thing to look at is whether you get plate tectonics or a stagnant lid. And so here's another one of these diagrams that shows this is the yield stress, and the colours show the convective regime. So red is plate-like, black is stagnant, and green is episodic. So what it shows, as before, is that at high yield stress it's stagnant, and at low yield stress it's plate-like. But on this axis is the continental area, like up to 40%. And the notable thing is that as you go from no continents to even a small continent, you get a step change in the critical yield stress. So having even a small continent in there makes it much easier to get plate tectonics. So the conclusion from this is that, yes, even if the presence of even a small continent gives you more easier plate tectonics. So continents could be important in plate tectonics. Now here's a let's try and get this to play. Yeah, I don't know why this doesn't play. It was working okay earlier. Anyway, we can just look at a single snapshot. This is, again, a case with a single large continent. I think you set that to the 20 minute thing. So we could have 30 minutes. Ticking down. Anyway, yes, this is with several continents, and one thing we looked at is the age distribution of the oceanic floor that results from this. Because one interesting observation of Earth is that when you plot the area as a function of age, then you get this triangular distribution. So here's the age of the oceanic floor, here's the relative amount, or actually, yeah. And it follows this triangular distribution, which is sort of odd because it's not what you would expect from simple convection. I mean, normally in convection, the upper boundary layer would go down when it reaches a certain age. Whereas here, the implication of a triangular distribution is that the probability of subduction is independent of age, which is very odd. And so you can look at this from convection models and see what it looks like. And so if you only have plate tectonics, this is the black line, then it doesn't look particularly triangular. In fact, at a very young age, it goes down, as you would expect, because the lithosphere is not dense enough. And then if you have continents, but not plate tectonics, which is the red curve, then it doesn't look triangular either. But when you combine these, you have continents and plate tectonics, you do get something that's similar to a triangular distribution, although not perfectly triangular. So it seems like you need these two ingredients, plate tectonics and continents, to get the right distribution. And, well, it turns out it's not always triangular, but it varies with time. So at this time, the distribution is triangular, but at this time, it's more sort of flat, which is what you would expect from convection. And at this time, there's a bias towards young subduction. And this is also observed if you look at some work by Dietmar Müller and co-workers. He also gets that for Earth, the distribution changes with time, and it's not always triangular. So what we plan to do is actually compare this to Earth observations. And the last thing we can look at with this type of model is temperatures. So here plotted is the temperature underneath the continents and the temperature underneath the oceans. And this is for a single supercontinent. And what you see is that the area under the continent is always hotter than the area under the oceanic plates. Another thing we can look at is the natural heterogeneity spectrum. And this shows spherical harmonic degree. This is time on this axis. So with a single supercontinent, it generates very long wavelength heterogeneity. So dominant is L equals 1. But with no continent, the dominant degree varies quite a lot with time, and it's shorter wavelength. Now, how about the same thing for models with several continents? Well, here it's much more complicated and messy. So this is the temperature underneath each individual continent, and it varies quite a lot with time. And sometimes it's hotter than under the ocean plates, which is blue. Sometimes it's cooler. So what's going on there? Well, what's going on is that it depends what the continents are doing. And if we look here, there's a sequence of frames going through the assembly of a supercontinent and then its subsequent breakup. So these are looking at the same thing from different angles. And then we can plot the temperature under the continents. We find that once the supercontinent assembles, it sort of shoots up to high values, and then when the supercontinent breaks apart, the temperature decreases. So that's what is causing this variation in the temperatures. So this summarizes what I've said. So a free surface leads to single-sided subduction, although eventually we get a stagnant lid. And continents make plate tectonics easier. They help you to get the triangular oceanic age distribution, and they warm up the mantle under them, particularly when you get a supercontinent.
Okay, thank you, Paul, for a 45-minute talk and crammed into just over 25 minutes. With our next speaker ready, Margaret Jadamek, and we have a title. So we're going to pause here both days, and if you have questions, I'm sure he's happy to answer them. We're going to move on to try to get back on schedule.